Carl Jung, one of the most brilliant psychiatrists in history, uncovered something that chilled him to the core, something most people instinctively avoid because it is too uncomfortable to face. There is a certain type of person walking among us who at first glance appears withdrawn, dimmed, or emotionally distant. Someone who seems to have stepped away from life itself because the noise of the world became unbearable. But Jung realized that beneath that apparent calm, beneath that gaze that seems lost in empty space, something intense is forming, something the average society cannot comprehend. He devoted decades of his life to studying what happens when a person with an extraordinary capacity to feel, someone deeply empathetic and perceptive, endures a trauma so severe that withdrawal becomes the only option, not a preference, not a personality trait, a necessity. What he discovered was unsettling. Only a very small percentage of those who enter this psychological state emerge intact. The majority either collapse under the unbearable weight of what they have witnessed and absorbed, or they become trapped in a grey psychological borderland, a limbo between worlds. Too aware to return to society's superficial normality, yet too wounded to fully stand alone. They exist in a no-man's land of consciousness, slowly eroding from the inside. But if you are still here, still listening, that already says something different about you. Jung began to understand that he was not merely observing depression, nor simple social anxiety. He was witnessing a brutal internal metamorphosis. He described it as individuation under extreme pressure, a process so intense that it either annihilates you or forges you into something untouchable. Pressure that does not politely reshape you, but crushes you until only what is essential survives. If you have ever felt that solitude became preferable after betrayal, abandonment, or a deep emotional wound no one else seemed to understand, then you may be in the middle of this transformation right now. And what happens next matters, because this process can produce either a person permanently imprisoned by unconscious suffering or someone radically transformed, someone internally sovereign. You did not wake up one morning and choose isolation as a lifestyle aesthetic. You did not decide to become distant because it seemed interesting. This was survival. You adapted because you saw too much. You experienced too many betrayals from hands that promised protection. You witnessed too many smiling faces, hiding sharpened intentions behind polite words. You heard too many promises dissolve at the exact moment they were most needed. You encountered people who claimed to care, who said they loved you, who declared loyalty, yet vanished the moment love required sacrifice. Before you withdrew, you were likely the opposite of cold. You were intensely sensitive. You were the emotional shock absorber in your family, your friendships, your workplace. Others unloaded their frustrations, their fears, their chaos onto you. You absorbed it because you believed that was love. You were taught, explicitly or subtly, that being good meant enduring, that being valuable meant being useful, that to be worthy of affection, you had to solve problems others created. You became hyper-aware. You learned to read a room before you entered it. You could sense tension in the air, like static electricity before a storm. You detected emotional landmines in casual conversations. You developed the near-supernatural ability to anticipate what others needed before they consciously knew it themselves. But this was not a mystical blessing. It was not a cosmic gift bestowed upon you for spiritual reasons. It was a survival mechanism forged in unpredictability. When your emotional or physical safety depends on correctly predicting someone else's mood. Your nervous system rewires itself around threat detection. When peace depends on managing the emotional volatility of others, you become a human radar. When your value depends solely on usefulness, you become indispensable until something inside fractures from exhaustion. To understand your current state, we must examine the mechanism your mind built. This was not simple intuition. Jung observed something far deeper, a dissolution of personal boundaries. You stopped existing as an independent center of experience and became an extension of other people's nervous systems. You monitored, you adjusted, you calculated, constantly. Imagine being a scientist trapped in a hazardous laboratory 24 hours a day. Every gesture, every tone shift, every silence becomes data. You analyze footsteps in the hallway, you decode the weight of a sigh. You measure the subtle change in someone placing keys on a table. You learn that a certain kind of silence in the kitchen means an explosion is imminent. You master the exact phrase that diffuses emotional bombs seconds before detonation. And this did not remain in childhood. It evolved with you. In the digital age, your hyper-awareness simply found new channels. You could sense impending conflict through punctuation alone, a period where one normally would not exist. The absence of an emoji that was always there before, a delayed reply that carries a different emotional temperature. You read between lines others never noticed were written. Over time, this vigilance becomes exhausting. The nervous system cannot sustain permanent alertness without consequence. Eventually, the psyche makes a drastic decision. It retreats, not because it hates people, not because it lacks love, but because it can no longer afford the cost of continuous emotional exposure. Isolation, then, is not emptiness. It is recovery space. However, this is where the danger lies. If the withdrawal becomes bitterness, if awareness turns into cynicism, the individual can freeze in that grey borderland Jung described. But if the withdrawal becomes introspection, if solitude transforms into conscious integration, then something extraordinary begins to happen. Individuation is the process by which a person becomes psychologically whole. It is not about becoming better than others. It is about becoming internally aligned. During extreme pressure, false identities collapse. The role of rescuer disintegrates. The mask of constant availability cracks. The illusion that love must be earned through suffering dissolves. In solitude, you begin to ask uncomfortable questions. Who am I when I am not managing others? Who am I when I am not needed? Who am I when I am not absorbing chaos? At first, the silence feels threatening. There is no emotional noise to decode, no signals to interpret, no crises to preempt. And in that quiet, you encounter something unfamiliar, yourself. This encounter can feel destabilizing because your identity was previously organized around external regulation. Without that, you may feel temporarily empty, but that emptiness is not a void, it is space. Space where your own desires, boundaries, and preferences slowly re-emerge. Jung believed that confronting one's shadow, the unacknowledged parts of oneself, was essential for transformation. In isolation, you begin to see your anger, your resentment, your grief, not as weaknesses, but as information. You realize you were not weak for feeling deeply. You were overwhelmed. You were overextended. You were operating without boundaries. The transformation occurs when empathy remains, but self-abandonment does not. When sensitivity remains, but hypervigilance softens. When you can read a room, yet choose not to absorb it. When you can sense emotional turbulence without taking responsibility for calming it. At this stage, you become different, not colder, but clearer, not distant, but discerning. You no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. You no longer equate sacrifice with love. You understand that your nervous system is not a public utility. The world may interpret this change as detachment. In truth, it is integration. You are no longer dissolving into others to survive. You are standing within yourself. And here is the paradox Jung hinted at. The same sensitivity that once made you vulnerable becomes your strength once integrated. The radar remains, but it is now selective. The awareness remains, but it is grounded. You no longer predict emotional storms to prevent being harmed. You recognize them to decide whether you even wish to enter the room. The pressure that once threatened to break you becomes the forge that shaped you. This is not a comfortable process. It is not quick. It demands honesty that few are willing to endure. But those who survive it do not return to who they were before. They do not need to. They have met themselves in silence and discovered that they are not empty. They are sovereign. And if you are in the middle of this transformation, feeling both isolated and intensely aware, understand this. You are not broken. You are in transition. The withdrawal was not your failure. It was your system protecting you long enough for you to rebuild consciously. The outcome now depends on whether you use solitude as a hiding place or as a laboratory for self-creation. Because under extreme pressure, you are either fragmented by unconscious pain or you emerge integrated, self-possessed, and internally free. And the fact that you are still here, still reflecting, suggests that your story is not one of collapse, but of becoming. A response that arrived 3 minutes later than usual was enough to tell you that something was off. You didn't need proof. You didn't need a confession. The delay itself was data. People called you paranoid. They said you overthought everything, that you were too intense, too suspicious, too sensitive to details that didn't matter. But you knew the truth in your bones. This wasn't paranoia. It was survival mathematics. When your emotional safety depends on reading the room correctly, your brain does not remain ordinary. It evolves. It sharpens. It becomes a behavioral supercomputer designed to detect threat long before it fully reveals itself. And this is where the story turns dark. Because people who eventually isolate themselves the way you did were not merely exposed to abuse or neglect. You studied it. You catalogued it. Without consciously deciding to, you became a living archive of human dysfunction. Every micro-expression that contradicted a kind word, every subtle shift in tone that exposed a lie hiding beneath reassurance, every manipulative behavioral loop that repeated itself with surgical precision. You noticed everything. Your unconscious mind stored all of it. It built psychological profiles of the very people who claimed to love you. If someone could have opened that internal archive and seen what you knew, it would have frightened them. Not because you were cruel, but because your perception was precise. You saw weaknesses. You saw traumas. You saw the deep insecurities behind the masks. And the most unsettling part? You never used that knowledge against them. You had in your hands detailed maps of the most fragile parts of the people who hurt you. You knew exactly which sentence would emotionally devastate that toxic partner. You understood the precise combination of words that could shatter the confidence of that false friend. You could have exposed the most humiliating fears of your own family members with surgical accuracy. You had emotional nuclear codes. You could have reduced them to rubble without ever raising your voice. But you didn't. Instead, you absorbed more. You waited longer. You endured deeper. You clung to a fundamental lie, that if you were good enough, patient enough, understanding enough, eventually they would treat you with the same care you offered them. You believed your kindness was currency. You believed your loyalty would one day be rewarded. You believed unconditional love was an investment that would yield security. You were wrong, and that is the quiet tragedy of your story so far. You used your superior intelligence to protect your persecutors instead of protecting yourself. You shielded them from the consequences of their own behavior. You translated their cruelty into excuses. You turned their negligence into misunderstandings. You made yourself smaller so they wouldn't feel exposed. Until the moment everything changed. There is always a breaking point, a final betrayal, a rupture so undeniable that it shatters decades of conditioning in a single instant. Maybe it was discovering an infidelity after years of being told you were crazy for suspecting anything. Maybe it was realizing that your own family had unconsciously assigned you the role of scapegoat so they would never have to confront their own failures. Maybe it was that friend, the one you carried for years, who vanished the exact day you needed support. Or perhaps it was something simpler and more devastating, overhearing what someone truly thought of you after years of fake affection, or being blamed for setting a boundary for the first time in your life. Whatever the trigger was, something inside you clicked. It wasn't dramatic on the outside. There were no fireworks, no screaming declarations, but internally, a switch flipped in the darkness of your mind, and it will never be turned off again. What once felt like vague discomfort solidified into certainty. It was no longer intuition. It was clarity. Suddenly, the world felt unfamiliar. Conversations sounded different. Faces looked different. The same people who once seemed trustworthy now appeared layered, fragmented, transparent in ways you could not unsee. That internal click marked the beginning of your first phase of transformation. Cold observation. Almost without deciding, you stopped talking as much. Your voice faded in group settings, at family dinners, in friend circles. Not because you had nothing to say, but because for the first time, you were listening without the filter of hope. Before, whenever you noticed an inconsistency, your mind rushed to protect the other person. You invented explanations on their behalf because you wanted to believe in their goodness. Now that protective illusion was gone. You began to see the gap between words and actions with unbearable clarity. You noticed how someone's eyes flicked slightly to the side when fabricating a story to justify why they let you down. You perceived the subtle shift in breathing when guilt surfaced beneath defensiveness. You caught the micro-expression of contempt that flashed across a face before the polite smile returned. You were witnessing the architecture of deception in real time. What disturbed you most was not that these patterns existed. It was that you had been trained your entire life to ignore them. Suddenly, it became painfully obvious who only contacted you when they needed something. You saw how certain friends appeared enthusiastically when your life was going well, but evaporated like smoke when things became difficult. You observed how some family members consumed your energy endlessly, yet labeled you selfish the moment you attempted to close the tap. The patterns were no longer abstract. They were measurable. At this stage, people around you began to whisper. They said you had changed. They said you were negative, that you were creating problems. that you were imagining hostility where none existed, but you knew something profound. For the first time in your life, you were trusting what you had always seen but had been pressured to deny. Your nervous system, forged in the fire of relational trauma, now operated with clinical efficiency. Without the desperate need for approval that once blinded you, your internal radar functioned flawlessly. This was not paranoia. It was awareness. And awareness, in a world where most people live on autopilot, looks like madness to those who refuse to wake up. You became quieter, more reserved, almost invisible in social spaces. Others misinterpreted your silence as depression or arrogance. They were wrong. You were conducting a live psychological audit. Every interaction became data collection. You were evaluating consistency. Who keeps their word? Who offers endless excuses? Who shows up when there is nothing to gain? Who only appears when it benefits their image? Who asks about your life with genuine curiosity? And who uses your presence as a stage to perform their own monologue? Who respects your boundaries without negotiation? And who punishes you emotionally the moment you dare to establish one? The evidence accumulated, and it was devastating. You realized that many of your relationships were never mutual exchanges of affection. They were transactions, and you were the only one paying. You were the emotional provider, the stabilizer, the silent absorber of chaos. And as this realization settled into your bones, you entered the second phase of transformation, the integration of your shadow. This is where things become dangerous, not for you, but for the old structure of your life. Because you stop being nice, and you start being real. You begin to acknowledge the anger you once suppressed, the resentment you labeled as immaturity, the desire for fairness that you silenced to maintain harmony. You allow yourself to admit that you were not treated well, that you were manipulated, that you were used, and instead of turning that awareness inward as self-blame, you let it illuminate reality. Your shadow is not cruelty. It is truth without self-sacrifice. You no longer offer unlimited access to your time. You no longer explain your boundaries repeatedly. You no longer rescue people from consequences they created. And this shift destabilizes those who benefited from your previous compliance. They will attempt to provoke guilt. They will accuse you of becoming cold, selfish, distant. But what has truly changed is this: you have stopped betraying yourself. The person who once endured everything in silence is gone. In their place stands someone who observes first, speaks carefully, and acts deliberately. Someone who understands that empathy without boundaries becomes self-erasure. Someone who recognizes that loyalty without reciprocity becomes self-destruction. The world feels strange now because you are seeing it without distortion. You cannot return to who you were because that version of you required blindness to survive. And once you have seen clearly, you cannot pretend not to know. The click inside you was not the beginning of bitterness. It was the beginning of alignment. You are no longer protecting those who harm you. You are protecting your energy. You are protecting your time. You are protecting your mind. And that changes everything. Jung understood something that modern psychology often forgets or chooses to soften. You cannot heal what you refuse to acknowledge. And for most of your life, you have refused to acknowledge your own capacity for darkness, for defensive aggression, for the instinct to protect yourself when necessary. You were taught, subtly or directly, that having boundaries made you a bad person. You were conditioned to believe that saying no meant you were selfish. Somewhere along the way, you absorbed the idea that protecting yourself was an act of cruelty, that prioritizing your well-being meant you lacked compassion. So, you adapted. You became agreeable. You became accommodating. You learned to swallow your discomfort before it reached your lips. You silenced your anger before it could form words. You minimized your needs so others would not feel inconvenienced. And in doing so, you slowly abandoned yourself. You kept giving, smiling, helping, understanding, forgiving, while something inside you withered. You performed kindness like a role on a stage, even as you felt increasingly empty behind the curtain. Over time, you became a shell, a hollow version of yourself, applauded for your goodness while quietly dying inside. But something shifts when you begin integrating your shadow. Integration is not about becoming darker. It is about becoming whole. It is the moment you stop dividing yourself into acceptable and unacceptable parts. You begin to accept the full spectrum of your humanity. Yes, you can be gentle. Yes, you can be generous. Yes, you can be compassionate. But you also discover that you can be firm, even relentless, when the situation demands it. You realize that kindness does not exclude strength. Compassion does not cancel power. You recognize that you can be warm and open-hearted, but you can also be cold as ice when someone repeatedly violates your boundaries. You can forgive, but you also possess the ability to remove someone from your life with surgical precision and never look back. Not out of hatred, not out of revenge, but out of clarity. You finally see that you have been denying yourself access to half of your power. The part that protects, the part that decides, the part that says, enough. You were taught that anger is negative, destructive, shameful. But when you examine it honestly, you realize that anger is information. It is your body's alarm system. It is the signal that something is unjust, something is misaligned, something needs to change. Anger is not the enemy. Unconscious anger is. Suppressed anger is. When you listen to it without letting it control you, it becomes guidance. It becomes data about your limits, your values, your dignity. You come to understand that self-protection is not a character flaw. It is a biological necessity. Every living organism defends itself. Why should you be the exception? Why were you convinced that enduring harm silently was a virtue? As you begin to give yourself permission to access the parts of you that were once labeled unacceptable, something remarkable happens. The people around you feel unsettled. The version of you that absorbed mistreatment without complaint starts reflecting behavior back like a flawless mirror. The one who used to apologize for existing begins to take up space without offering explanations or justifications. The transformation is radical. The person who used to smile through pain now expresses genuine emotion without a filter. The one who said yes to everything begins to say no without a trace of guilt. The one who chased after people, terrified they might leave, now opens the door and lets them go without a fight. You stop bargaining for love. You stop negotiating your worth. You stop shrinking to make others comfortable. And not everyone appreciates this evolution. In fact, many resist it. They preferred you when you were manageable, when your predictability gave them control. They liked you when they could blame you, manipulate you, or rely on your endless understanding without ever offering the same in return. They were comfortable when your kindness was guaranteed, when your presence was an unquestioned accessory in their lives. But now, you are no longer predictable. You are no longer easily controlled. You have become sovereign. This loss of control can provoke surprising cruelty. Some will attempt to guilt you. Others will criticize you. Some may accuse you of changing, as if growth were a betrayal. They may try to push you back into the small box where you once lived, the box labeled agreeable, accommodating, self-sacrificing. But you no longer fit there. You have outgrown it. Your consciousness has expanded. Your sense of self has deepened. You cannot compress yourself back into a shape that was built from fear. At some point, you realize that being alone is not a punishment. It is mastery. When you no longer need someone else to define you, validate you, or reflect your value back to you, you reach a level of freedom that youth could never grant. In youth, we often seek ourselves in the eyes of others. We measure our worth through approval, attention, and attachment. But as you mature, you begin to withdraw that projection. You stop asking, "Who am I?" to them, and start asking, "Who am I to myself?" Aging, in this sense, is not decay. It is refinement. It is the art of letting go of everything you are not, so that you can remain with what you have always been. The masks fall away. The roles dissolve. The performances end. What remains is something quieter, but infinitely more solid. A self that does not beg. A self that does not chase. A self that does not apologize for existing. Do not fear when the stage begins to empty. Do not panic when certain people fall away as you grow. The silence that follows is not emptiness. It is space. It is the sacred pause where your real life begins. In that silence, you hear your own thoughts more clearly. You feel your own instincts more strongly. You act not from fear of abandonment, but from alignment with your truth. This is the paradox Jung pointed toward. You become lighter by accepting your darkness. You become more loving by acknowledging your capacity for anger. You become more compassionate when you stop tolerating disrespect. Wholeness is not about being purely good. It is about being integrated. And once you are integrated, you cannot be easily manipulated, because you are no longer divided within yourself. Your true life begins the moment you stop trying to be harmless and start choosing to be conscious. When you no longer reject half of who you are, you step into a depth of freedom that cannot be taken from you. In the quiet aftermath of shedding illusions, you discover something powerful and simple. You were never meant to be small. You were meant to be whole.